Nick had always thought his marriage to Linda was solid. Sure, they had their arguments, but who didn't? After 10 years together, he figured they were just in one of those inevitable rough patches that happen in any long-term relationship. Linda had been pulling away a bit, spending more time at work, brushing off his attempts to make plans, and, more often than not, glued to her phone. He chalked it up to stress. Her job in marketing was demanding, and Nick understood that as much as anyone. But then there were the little things. The way she'd smile at her screen and quickly turn it away when he walked into the room. The way she'd leave for work events dressed just a little more carefully than usual. Nick didn't want to seem paranoid. He trusted Linda. At least he wanted to. Still, a nagging voice in the back of his mind told him something was off. It wasn't until a rainy Thursday night that his suspicions turned into cold, hard proof. Linda had left her phone charging in the kitchen while she was taking a shower. Normally, Nick wouldn't have touched it. He respected her privacy. But that night, a notification lit up the screen, and he caught a glimpse of the sender, Dwayne. His stomach sank. Dwayne was Linda's coworker, someone she'd mentioned in passing, but never in much detail. Against his better judgment, Nick unlocked her phone. What he found made his hands tremble. Nick's hands felt clammy as he scrolled through the email thread. The messages were unmistakably intimate. There were casual jokes, flirty remarks, and phrases so deeply familiar they cut straight to his heart. The most damning evidence lay in a recent exchange. Dwayne had written, "Paris is just a few weeks away, and I can't wait to finally have you all to myself. Does Nick suspect anything yet? Or is he still the oblivious little puppy you've described?" Linda's reply was worse. "Nick, he doesn't have a clue. He's so busy being the perfect husband that he doesn't even notice what's right under his nose. Paris will be everything we've dreamed of, Dwayne. Just you and me. Red hard." Nick's breath caught in his throat. The words on the screen blurred as a wave of disbelief, anger, and humiliation crashed over him. He felt like a fool. The woman he'd built his life with, shared dreams with, had not only betrayed him, but mocked him. For a moment, he couldn't move. He stood frozen in the dim light of the kitchen, the sound of Linda humming in the shower in the background. The casual normalcy of it made the betrayal feel even more surreal. His instincts as a lawyer kicked in. He quickly forwarded the emails to his private account and made copies of everything. Evidence, he told himself. He needed evidence. Not because he wasn't sure of what he saw, but because he knew the battle ahead would require preparation. Linda emerged from the bathroom a few minutes later, towel wrapped around her damp hair. She gave Nick a quick glance. "What's wrong?" she asked, noticing his stiff posture. Nick forced a tight-lipped smile. "Nothing. Just got a work email that threw me off," he said, his voice betraying none of the storm raging inside him. Her eyes lingered on him for a moment, but then she shrugged and went about her evening as if nothing had happened. It was almost impressive, Nick thought bitterly, how seamlessly she could compartmentalize her double life. That night, he barely slept. Lying next to Linda felt unbearable, but he couldn't let her know what he'd discovered, not yet. His mind raced through scenarios. Should he confront her? Should he call Dwayne and demand answers? Or should he go straight to a divorce attorney? By morning, he had made up his mind. Confronting her without a plan would only give her the upper hand. No, he would wait. He would play the role of the oblivious husband a little longer while he built his case. If Linda and Dwayne thought he was naive, then that's exactly what he'd let them believe. As he lay in bed staring at the ceiling, Nick couldn't shake the bitter irony. He'd spent his entire career exposing deception in legal battles, yet he hadn't seen the betrayal unfolding in his own home. It was a lesson he would not forget. Nick bided his time, though it tested every ounce of his patience. Each day was a quiet war between his growing anger and his need to remain composed. He played the part of the devoted husband perfectly, still making Linda coffee in the mornings, still asking about her day, still pretending he didn't know about the Paris trip or the venomous way she described him to Dwayne. But inside, he was a tempest. Every glance at her phone, every smile she gave when she thought he wasn't looking, made his blood boil. He rehearsed a dozen confrontations in his mind, each one more explosive than the last. Yet when the moment came, it wasn't planned. It erupted spontaneously. It was a Friday evening, and Linda was sitting on the couch, scrolling through her phone. The sight of her, so comfortable, so utterly unbothered, ignited something in Nick. Before he could stop himself, the words came tumbling out. "Do you love him?" Linda froze, her phone slipping slightly in her hand. Her face flickered with confusion before settling into a wary expression. "What are you talking about?" Nick didn't blink. He had spent years cross-examining people in courtrooms, and now all that experience came flooding back. "Don't play dumb, Linda. I saw the emails. Paris, Dwayne, the whole thing. So, I'll ask you again, do you love him?" Her face went pale, and for a moment, she said nothing. Then, with a shaky exhale, she set her phone down. "Nick, spare me the excuses," he interrupted, his voice steady but icy. "I want the truth just once. How long has this been going on?" Linda's lips pressed into a thin line. She looked down at her lap, as if the answers were written there. "A few months," she admitted quietly. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this, Nick. I didn't mean for—" "Don't," he cut her off again, his tone sharp enough to make her flinch. "Don't insult me by pretending you're the victim here." She sat back, crossing her arms defensively. "You don't understand. You've been so distant lately, so focused on work. I felt invisible." Nick laughed bitterly. "Invisible? That's your justification for sneaking around with someone else? For lying to me? For mocking me in those emails?" Her eyes widened slightly, guilt flashing across her face. "I didn't mean those things. I was venting. You're not naive. You just what, Linda?" Nick's voice rose for the first time. "You just decided that cheating on me and planning a romantic getaway behind my back was easier than talking to me? Easier than trying to fix what was broken?" The room fell silent, the weight of his words hanging heavy between them. Linda looked away, tears forming in her eyes. But Nick didn't feel sympathy, only anger, betrayal, and a cold sense of clarity. "I want you out," he said finally, his voice low but firm. "Pack your things and go. You can stay with Dwayne or in a hotel, I don't care. But you're not staying here." "Nick, wait," she pleaded, her voice trembling. "Can we talk about this? Can't we try to?" "There's nothing to talk about, Linda." He stood, looking down at her, with an expression so resolute it left no room for argument. "You made your choice. Now you have to live with it." After Linda packed her bags and left that night, the house felt eerily quiet. Nick sat on the edge of their bed, his bed now, staring blankly at the floor. The anger that had fueled him during the confrontation had burned out, leaving a gaping void in its place. He felt hollow, as if someone had scooped out his insides and left him a shell of who he used to be. At first, all he could do was replay the past few months in his mind, over and over, trying to pinpoint the exact moment things had started falling apart. Was it his fault? Had he missed some crucial signs? Should he have noticed earlier, fought harder to keep her attention? The questions spiraled endlessly, each one more painful than the last. The betrayal cut deeper than he thought possible. This wasn't just about infidelity. It was about trust, about the life they'd built together. He thought back to their wedding day, the promises they'd made, the dreams they'd shared. How could someone he knew so intimately become a stranger so quickly? Sadness gave way to anger in unpredictable bursts. He'd slam his fist on the table, curse loudly into the emptiness of the house, or crumple her leftover notes and throw them across the room. But even that felt unsatisfying. The emotions were too big, too overwhelming to be released in one outburst. Sleep was impossible. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her face, not the Linda he married, but the Linda who had mocked him with Dwayne, who had lied to his face while planning their future without him. His chest tightened with a mix of rage and grief. Nick stopped answering his phone, even when friends or family called. He wasn't ready to explain, wasn't ready for their pity. He worked on autopilot during the day, handling cases with mechanical efficiency, but feeling no connection to them. At night, he drank just enough to dull the ache, but not enough to drown it. It wasn't until a week later that the fog started to lift. One evening, he found himself staring at the stack of printed emails he'd made, the damning evidence of Linda's affair. He realized something. As much as he hated her betrayal, it wasn't going to define him. If Linda and Dwayne thought they'd destroyed him, they were wrong. He was still Nick, the sharp, meticulous lawyer, the man who had built his career on preparation and strategy. He couldn't undo what had happened, but he could control what came next. For the first time in days, he felt a flicker of determination. This wasn't the end of his story. If anything, it was the beginning of a new chapter, one where he wouldn't let himself be blindsided again. He spent the rest of the night formulating a plan. If Linda had shattered their marriage, he would make sure she paid for it, not out of petty vengeance, but because he deserved justice. With a steady hand, he filed the emails into a folder labeled Divorce Strategy. As he closed the folder, a small, grim smile played on his lips. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Nick's mind was made up. Divorce wasn't just a possibility. It was inevitable. He wasn't the kind of man who could forgive betrayal on this level. Linda's actions had destroyed the foundation of their marriage, and there was no salvaging what was left. But Nick wasn't content to let the process play out on autopilot. He was a lawyer, after all, and a good one. If there was one thing he understood, it was the power of preparation. He had seen too many clients enter divorce proceedings unprepared, only to lose assets, custody, or dignity. That wouldn't be him. The first step was research. Virginia law, as Nick knew, allowed for fault-based divorces, and adultery was a significant factor. This could impact everything: alimony, property division, even the speed of the divorce process. The emails he'd uncovered weren't just proof of betrayal. They were a weapon, and he intended to wield them with precision. He began gathering every document that could be relevant. Bank statements, property deeds, joint investments, anything that showed the financial landscape of their marriage. He made copies of everything, storing them securely on an encrypted drive. He also reviewed their prenuptial agreement, which he'd almost forgotten about in the chaos. It wasn't airtight, but it had clauses that could work in his favor, especially under the circumstances. Next, he sought advice. While Nick was well-versed in the law, he understood the value of a second opinion. He reached out to a trusted colleague, another divorce attorney, under the guise of discussing a client's case. Over coffee, they discussed strategies for handling infidelity in a high-stakes divorce. The conversation gave Nick even more clarity about the steps he needed to take. Meanwhile, he maintained his poker face at home. Linda, who had moved in with a friend temporarily, texted him a few times, asking if they could talk. He didn't respond. Her words didn't matter anymore. Actions spoke louder, and hers had been deafening. As part of his plan, Nick quietly started consolidating his control over their shared assets. Using the power of attorney Linda had signed years ago, he began the process of selling their house. It was risky. She could contest it later, but Nick was confident he could justify his actions as necessary to cover debts and expenses. The house wasn't just a financial asset. It was a symbol of their shared life, and Nick had no intention of letting her keep it. Despite his meticulous planning, the emotional toll was still heavy. Every document he filed, every text from Linda he ignored, felt like a tiny dagger to the heart. But each step also brought a strange sense of empowerment. For the first time since discovering her affair, he felt like he was reclaiming control. Nick's resolve solidified as he looked at his to-do list one evening. The tasks were overwhelming: selling the house, managing the legal proceedings, protecting his interests, but they gave him purpose. He wasn't just reacting to what Linda had done. He was taking charge of his future. By the end of the week, he had a clear roadmap. The divorce would be messy, no doubt about it, but Nick was ready for the fight. Linda had underestimated him, and that was her first mistake. Her second mistake was thinking he'd ever let her walk away unscathed. Nick's strategy wasn't just about securing the divorce. He wanted to ensure that Linda came out of it with as little leverage as possible. While his emotions still simmered beneath the surface, his actions were calculated and cold. If she thought she could walk away from this with her dignity intact, she was mistaken. The first major move involved their house. Using the power of attorney Linda had signed years ago, a detail she had likely forgotten about, Nick finalized the sale of their home. It wasn't just a financial maneuver. It was a message. The house had been their shared space, the backdrop for years of memories. Now, it would be gone just like their marriage. To ensure the sale went unnoticed, Nick worked discreetly. He met with Maggie, a notary and an old friend, under the guise of handling estate matters for a client. Maggie notarized the documents without asking too many questions, trusting Nick's professionalism. Linda had no idea that while she was out with Dwayne, Nick was quietly dismantling their shared assets. As part of his plan, Nick also started redirecting funds from their joint accounts. Nothing illegal, just enough to ensure he maintained control over the majority of their liquid assets. He knew Linda would fight for alimony, especially given her lower salary, but the adultery would weaken her claim. By the time she realized what he had done, it would be too late to contest most of it. Throughout all of this, Nick maintained his facade. He responded to Linda's occasional texts with short, emotionless replies, never giving her a hint of what he was up to. She probably thought he was licking his wounds, mourning their broken marriage. In reality, he was orchestrating her downfall with the precision of a chess master. Linda, meanwhile, continued her affair with Dwayne, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing behind Nick's calm exterior. Nick had even begun using her carelessness to his advantage, keeping tabs on her movements through shared digital accounts and subtle inquiries. She was an open book, and he was taking notes on every page. The most satisfying part of his strategy was how completely Linda underestimated him. She had spent months portraying him as naive, blind to her betrayal. She didn't realize that every moment she spent with Dwayne only strengthened Nick's position. The final touch to his preparations was meeting with a private investigator. While Nick already had the emails as evidence, he wanted to ensure there was no room for doubt. The investigator's report included photos of Linda and Dwayne together, at restaurants, in hotel lobbies, even at a jewelry store where Dwayne had purchased a necklace. The images painted a picture that was impossible to refute. When Nick looked over the photos later that night, he felt a pang of something unexpected, pity. Not for Linda, but for himself. He had loved her once, had trusted her implicitly. Seeing her so openly happy with someone else was a reminder of what he had lost. But that moment of weakness passed quickly. This wasn't about love anymore. It was about justice. With everything in place, Nick knew the next phase of his plan would be the most challenging. He was ready to file for divorce. And when Linda received those papers, she would finally realize the depths of her mistake. For now, though, he waited. Timing was everything, and Nick was nothing if not patient. He would strike when she least expected it, ensuring that when the dust settled, he would be the one standing tall. Nick knew that emotional detachment wasn't going to come easily. Even after everything Linda had done, part of him still struggled with the idea of letting go of the life they had built together. Memories of their better days lingered in the back of his mind, threatening to undo his resolve. But he understood that moving forward meant severing the ties that bound him to her, emotionally, socially, and legally. The first step was distancing himself from her physically. Though Linda had already moved out temporarily, Nick made sure it was permanent. He instructed her to collect the rest of her belongings by the end of the week, setting clear boundaries that he wouldn't be present when she came by. He couldn't bear the thought of seeing her, let alone engaging in more drawn-out arguments or apologies. Her initial response was a string of messages, alternating between guilt-laden apologies and defensive accusations. "We need to talk," one text read. Another said, "You're being cold, Nick. We're still married. Don't shut me out." Nick didn't respond. He had already said all he needed to during their confrontation. Engaging with her now would only feed into her narrative or give her an opportunity to manipulate him. Instead, he spent the time focusing on what came next. To create further distance, he left town for a weekend under the guise of a work conference. In reality, he drove a few hours out of the city to stay with an old college friend, Tom, who lived in the countryside. Tom didn't pry too much into Nick's situation, sensing that Nick wasn't ready to spill all the details. Instead, they spent the weekend fishing, grilling, and reminiscing about simpler times. For the first time since the discovery, Nick felt a flicker of normalcy. During his brief retreat, Nick also made sure to establish an alibi, should Linda ever attempt to twist the narrative in her favor. He had always been cautious, but now, every move he made was deliberate. He consulted with other lawyer friends over casual dinners, ensuring they would remember the conversations if Linda tried to paint him as uncooperative or vindictive in the divorce. Socially, Nick began the slow process of untangling their lives. He informed mutual friends, carefully chosen ones, about the split, framing it as a mutual decision without divulging the full extent of Linda's betrayal. He didn't want to air their dirty laundry publicly, not yet anyway. For now, he would let Linda's actions speak for themselves. Emotionally, Nick's detachment was more challenging. Nights were still the hardest. The silence of the house was oppressive, a constant reminder of what had been lost. Occasionally, he found himself scrolling through old photos on his phone, lingering on snapshots of vacations, birthdays, and anniversaries. One night, he came across a picture of Linda on their honeymoon in Santorini. She was smiling at the camera, the Aegean Sea sparkling behind her. He stared at it for a long moment before quietly deleting it. It was a symbolic act, but it carried weight. He wasn't the man who took that picture anymore, and Linda wasn't the woman in it. Letting go of the memories was painful, but it was necessary. By the end of the week, Nick felt the beginnings of something he hadn't experienced in weeks: clarity. The ache in his chest hadn't disappeared, but it had dulled into something manageable. He could see the future more clearly now, and it didn't include Linda or the baggage of her betrayal. For the first time since the confrontation, Nick felt a glimmer of hope. This wasn't just about revenge or justice anymore. It was about reclaiming himself. The house had always been a cornerstone of Nick and Linda's life together, a symbol of the future they once dreamed of. Now it was a painful reminder of everything that had gone wrong. Selling it wasn't just practical, it was cathartic. Using the power of attorney Linda had signed years ago, Nick finalized the sale without her knowledge. He ensured every step was legal, leaving no room for her to contest the transaction later. Maggie, the notary, asked no questions, and the buyer, an investor, was eager to close quickly. On the day the deal went through, Nick stood in the empty living room for a moment, taking it all in. The walls no longer held photos or laughter. They were just walls. He let out a long breath and walked away without looking back. Later that evening, he took a box of sentimental items, old anniversary cards, Linda's wedding dress, and even a small photo album, and burned them in the backyard fire pit. As the flames consumed the relics of their life together, Nick felt an unexpected sense of peace. This wasn't just an act of closure. It was a declaration. Linda had betrayed him, but she hadn't broken him. The house had always been a cornerstone of Nick and Linda's life together, a symbol of the future they once dreamed of building. It had witnessed everything: their laughter, their arguments, and their quiet moments of love. Now it felt tainted, a painful reminder of betrayal and broken promises. Selling it wasn't just a financial decision. It was a necessary step toward reclaiming his life. Nick's plan to sell the house without Linda's knowledge was bold, but he approached it methodically. Using the power of attorney Linda had signed years ago, he finalized the sale with the precision of a seasoned lawyer. Maggie, the notary, didn't ask many questions, and the buyer, a local investor, was eager to close quickly. Nick made sure the paperwork was airtight, knowing Linda might try to contest it later. The day the sale closed, Nick returned to the now empty house one last time. Walking through the silent rooms, he felt a strange mix of emotions. This place had once been filled with life, with dreams of a future he'd truly believed in. Now it was just a shell. The walls that had held their wedding photos were bare. The living room, where they had spent countless evenings curled up on the couch, felt cold and lifeless. He stood in the kitchen, where he'd found the first email, and let the memories wash over him. It wasn't sadness anymore. It was resolve. This chapter of his life was over, and it was time to let go. With one last glance, Nick walked out the front door and didn't look back. Later that evening, Nick gathered a box of sentimental items he'd saved: old anniversary cards, keepsakes from vacations, Linda's wedding dress, and a small photo album documenting their early years together. He carried the box to the fire pit in the backyard, hesitating for only a moment before lighting the match. The flames roared to life, consuming the remnants of their shared history. He watched as the edges of the wedding dress darkened and curled, the fabric disintegrating into ash. Each item he fed to the fire felt like another weight lifted off his chest. The cards, the photos, even a love note Linda had written years ago, they all disappeared into the blaze. It was more than symbolic. It was closure. As the fire burned down to embers, Nick felt a sense of calm that had eluded him for weeks. The house was gone, the memories reduced to ash, and the future stretched out before him like an open road. For the first time, he didn't feel like a victim anymore. Linda might have betrayed him, but she hadn't broken him. Linda returned to the house a week later, thinking she would retrieve the rest of her belongings and, perhaps, use the opportunity to push for a conversation with Nick. She convinced herself that he'd calm down eventually, that they could at least reach some sort of understanding. What she didn't expect was to find an empty lot. Their house was gone. In its place was a patch of bare earth, the foundation still visible, but everything else erased. She stood frozen in the driveway, staring at the space where her life had once been. Panic set in as she frantically dialed Nick's number. When he didn't pick up, she left a string of increasingly desperate voicemails. "Nick, what's going on? Where's the house? You can't just sell it without telling me. Call me back. This is insane, Nick. Do you even care what you've done to us?" Nick listened to the voicemails later, that evening with a glass of bourbon in hand, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Linda's shock and confusion were exactly what he'd expected. She'd spent so much time believing he was naive and predictable, and now she was beginning to understand just how wrong she'd been. The fallout extended beyond the house. Word of Linda's affair had started to spread, thanks to the quiet whispers of mutual friends and colleagues who had seen her out with Dwayne. It didn't take long for the story to make its way back to her office. At work, Linda's coworkers began treating her differently, some with pity, others with barely concealed judgment. Her boss, aware of the affair, made it clear that her personal drama was affecting the team's reputation. Dwayne wasn't spared either. His smug demeanor disappeared as whispers turned to open disdain. Linda's personal life unraveled just as quickly. Friends who had once adored her now distanced themselves, either out of loyalty to Nick or discomfort with the situation. Even her family, who had initially offered her support, started asking hard questions. But the harshest blow came when Linda realized just how thorough Nick had been in his preparations. With the house sold and much of their joint assets already redistributed, she found herself struggling to stay afloat financially. The luxury lifestyle she'd taken for granted was slipping through her fingers. She tried confronting Nick directly, cornering him outside his office one afternoon. "How could you do this to me?" she demanded, her voice cracking. "You've taken everything." Nick regarded her with a calmness that only made her angrier. "Everything," he said quietly. "You mean the house? The money? Because I seem to recall you giving up something far more valuable when you chose to betray me." Her face crumpled, but Nick felt no satisfaction in her tears. He'd already made peace with the fact that this wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about protecting himself and ensuring she couldn't hurt him any further. As Linda walked away, defeated, Nick felt a strange sense of finality. The fallout was hers to deal with now. For the first time since the ordeal began, he felt free. Nick thought he was done with Linda and Dwayne. The house was sold, the assets secured, and the divorce process firmly under his control. He had crafted his life to minimize their influence, but fate had other plans. One afternoon, a mutual acquaintance, Carl, dropped by Nick's office. Carl was a local realtor and something of a gossip. Over coffee, he leaned in conspiratorially. "Did you hear about Dwayne?" he asked, barely able to contain his curiosity. Nick's brow furrowed. "What about him?" Carl smirked. "Let's just say karma's caught up. He was jumped outside a bar last weekend. Word is someone messed him up real good. He's in the hospital. Broken jaw, fractured ribs, the works." Nick's surprise was genuine. He hadn't orchestrated or even considered physical retaliation. "You're serious?" he asked, trying to hide his intrigue. "Dead serious," Carl replied. "And here's the kicker. People are saying it wasn't random. Dwayne's got enemies, but this was personal." Nick nodded, keeping his thoughts to himself. While he didn't condone violence, a small part of him couldn't help but feel a flicker of grim satisfaction. Dwayne had played a role in tearing apart his marriage. Now, it seemed he was facing consequences of his own. What unsettled Nick more was the mention of a mysterious figure. Rumors were circulating about someone known only as El Diablo, a name whispered with equal parts fear and reverence. Whoever this person was, they seemed to have a reputation for settling scores. Nick didn't dwell on the rumors for long. He hadn't hired anyone, and he didn't need to. Dwayne's downfall was, in Nick's mind, poetic justice, completely separate from his own plans. As for Linda, her humiliation deepened. The whispers about her affair were now public knowledge. Colleagues avoided her, friends ghosted her, and even Dwayne's condition became a source of mockery. People questioned her judgment, asking how she could throw away her life for a man who couldn't even protect himself. The once proud and confident Linda was now a shadow of herself. She reached out to Nick again, sending long, rambling emails and leaving tearful voicemails. She begged for another chance, apologizing for her mistakes and promising to change. Nick deleted each message without reading or listening to the end. He had no interest in reopening that chapter. She was desperate, yes, but desperation wasn't the same as love or redemption. What surprised Nick the most was his own reaction to the unfolding drama. A few weeks ago, he might have taken satisfaction in her misery, in seeing her reap what she had sown. Now he felt something closer to indifference. Linda and Dwayne were no longer his problem. They were footnotes in a chapter he had already closed. The divorce hearing arrived quietly, devoid of the drama Linda might have hoped for. Nick, as always, was impeccably prepared. His calm demeanor and ironclad evidence left no room for dispute. Linda, on the other hand, appeared frazzled, as though the weight of her unraveling life had finally caught up with her. Nick's lawyer presented the incriminating emails, the private investigators' photos, and the financial records showing Nick's careful management of their joint assets. The judge's disapproval was clear as he reviewed the evidence of Linda's affair. Adultery wasn't just a moral failing. It was a legal one, and in Virginia, it carried significant consequences. The ruling was swift and decisive. Linda was denied alimony, and Nick retained the bulk of their marital assets. The sale of the house, though contested by Linda, was upheld as lawful, leaving her with little leverage. For Nick, the moment was surreal. After weeks of planning and sleepless nights, it was over. The settlement wasn't just a victory in legal terms. It was a confirmation that his efforts to protect himself hadn't been in vain. As the courtroom emptied, Linda approached him, her eyes pleading. "Nick, please," she began, her voice trembling. "I made a mistake. Can't we at least talk? I don't want to end things like this." Nick met her gaze, his expression unreadable. For a moment, he felt a pang of something close to pity. But he quickly reminded himself of the cruelty in her emails, the disdain with which she had mocked him to Dwayne. "There's nothing to talk about, Linda," he said evenly. "This is the ending you chose. Now you have to live with it." Linda's face crumpled, and she turned away, defeated. That evening, Nick sat alone in his new apartment, a modest but modern space that felt more like his than the old house ever had. A bottle of whiskey sat on the counter, untouched. Instead, he poured himself a glass of water and stared out the window at the city lights. The victory felt strangely quiet. He had won, but it wasn't triumph he felt. It was peace. The anger, the bitterness, the sense of betrayal. They had all dulled to a faint ache, something he could live with. In the weeks that followed, Nick began to rebuild. He focused on work, spent more time with friends, and even picked up old hobbies he'd neglected during his marriage. Life wasn't perfect, but it was his again. When asked by a close friend how he felt about the ordeal, Nick paused, considering his answer carefully. "I learned that trust is fragile," he said finally. "But I also learned that I'm stronger than I thought. Sometimes justice isn't about getting even, it's about reclaiming yourself." The weeks following the divorce were a mix of relief and quiet introspection for Nick. The constant tension of the past months had lifted, leaving behind an unfamiliar calm. His life was no longer dictated by Linda's betrayal or the elaborate plans he devised to protect himself. It was his again, and he was learning what that meant. Nick found himself rediscovering parts of himself that had been buried under years of routine and compromise. He picked up his old guitar, its strings dusty from neglect, and spent evenings strumming out melodies that mirrored his shifting emotions. The music was imperfect, raw, and sometimes sad, but it felt authentic, something he hadn't experienced in a long time. Socially, Nick began reconnecting with friends he'd lost touch with during his marriage. They'd always been supportive, but he'd often prioritized Linda or work over them. Now, he realized how much he needed their camaraderie. A poker night here, a hiking trip there, it was a slow but rewarding process of rebuilding his circle. The unexpected part was how little he thought about Linda and Dwayne. The anger that had once consumed him had faded into something closer to indifference. Occasionally, he'd hear about them through mutual acquaintances. Dwayne had returned to work, though he was noticeably subdued, and Linda was struggling to adapt to her new reality. But their lives no longer felt intertwined with his. They were simply people he used to know. One evening, Nick sat down with a journal, a habit he'd started during the divorce to help process his thoughts. Flipping through the pages, he saw entries filled with anger, pain, and determination. But as he wrote now, his tone was different. "I've learned that life is unpredictable," he wrote, the pen gliding smoothly over the paper. "People you love can hurt you in ways you never imagined. But that doesn't mean you stop loving yourself. I've lost a lot, but I've also gained something invaluable: clarity. I know who I am, and I know what I deserve. Moving forward, I'll build my life on that foundation." As he closed the journal, Nick realized he didn't feel bitter anymore. Linda's actions had broken his heart, but they hadn't broken him. If anything, they had made him stronger, more self-aware, and more resilient. He allowed himself a small smile. The future was still unwritten, but for the first time in a long while, it felt like something to look forward to. With the weight of the past finally behind him, Nick began to focus on the opportunities ahead. Life, once consumed by legal battles and emotional turmoil, felt wide open. He realized he had the freedom to rebuild, not just his career or social life, but his sense of purpose. The first step was creating a routine that was entirely his own. Mornings started with long runs through the park, a habit he'd abandoned years ago. The rhythmic pounding of his feet on the pavement cleared his mind, each step a reminder that he was moving forward, literally and figuratively. Work became a source of pride again. For months, he'd gone through the motions, keeping up appearances while his personal life crumbled. Now he poured his energy into cases that challenged him. He even took on a pro bono case for a single mother fighting for custody, a decision that reminded him why he'd become a lawyer in the first place. Socially, Nick began to embrace spontaneity. He accepted invitations to happy hours, joined a local trivia league, and even signed up for a cooking class, a suggestion from his sister, who insisted he needed at least one edible recipe in his repertoire. To his surprise, he found himself enjoying the experience. It wasn't about mastering techniques. It was about creating something from scratch, something uniquely his. Then there were the moments of quiet reflection, the nights he spent at home with a good book or a glass of wine. These weren't lonely moments. They were grounding. Nick had spent so much time defining himself through his marriage and career that he'd forgotten what it was like to simply be. Romance wasn't on his radar yet, though friends tried to nudge him in that direction. "You've got to get back out there," Tom said during one of their poker nights. "The best way to move on is to meet someone new." Nick only smiled. He wasn't ready, and he was okay with that. Healing wasn't a race, and he wanted to be sure he was whole before inviting someone else into his life. One Saturday morning, Nick sat on his balcony, sipping coffee as the city stirred to life below. He opened a small notebook where he'd started jotting down goals, not just career ambitions, but personal ones. Travel to Iceland, learn to kayak, volunteer more, say yes to new experiences. The list was still short, but it represented something powerful: hope. For the first time in a long while, Nick felt excited about the future. He didn't know exactly where life would take him, but he was ready to find out. Nick wasn't actively seeking new relationships, but life had a way of surprising him. As he immersed himself in rebuilding his life, he began to form connections that were unexpected yet deeply fulfilling. It started with his cooking class. Nick hadn't thought much of it when he signed up. It was just another way to fill his time and learn something new. But as the weeks went by, he found himself looking forward to the sessions. The group was small but diverse, ranging from retirees to young professionals, and the atmosphere was warm and collaborative. One evening, as they worked on perfecting a mushroom risotto, he struck up a conversation with a woman named Elena. She was a journalist who had recently moved to the city, and her quick wit and easy laugh drew him in. They bonded over their mutual inability to keep their dishes from sticking to the pan, joking about their shared culinary disasters. By the end of the class, Elena suggested grabbing a coffee sometime to compare cooking scars. It wasn't a date, it didn't feel like one at least, but it was a connection, and that was enough for Nick. In addition to the cooking class, Nick found himself growing closer to his colleagues. He'd always kept work and personal life separate, but after everything he'd been through, he allowed himself to open up. A lunch meeting with his paralegal, Sophie, turned into an honest conversation about navigating heartbreak and starting over. To his surprise, she shared her own experiences, and their professional dynamic shifted to something more supportive and personal. Even his old friends noticed the change. "You're lighter," Tom remarked one evening over drinks. "I don't know how else to describe it. It's like you're finally letting yourself breathe." Nick nodded, realizing Tom was right. He wasn't carrying the same weight he had been before. The anger and bitterness that had defined him for so long had been replaced by a cautious optimism. One of the most unanticipated connections came during a volunteering event. Nick had signed up to mentor at a local community center, working with teens interested in law and advocacy. One of the students, a sharp, outspoken girl named Maya, reminded him of himself at that age, determined, curious, and eager to make a difference. Their conversations reignited Nick's passion for mentoring. Maya's questions about justice and fairness reminded him of why he pursued law in the first place. For the first time in years, he felt like he was giving back in a meaningful way. Through these new connections, Nick began to see the value of vulnerability. He wasn't the same man he had been before Linda's betrayal, but that wasn't a bad thing. The pain had reshaped him, carving out room for growth and new relationships that enriched his life in ways he hadn't anticipated. Months turned into a year, and Nick's life felt like a distant echo of what it once was. The pain of Linda's betrayal had faded, replaced by a deep appreciation for the life he had built after the storm. He no longer thought of the past with bitterness. Instead, it served as a reminder of his resilience and the power of starting over. Sitting on his balcony one evening, Nick looked over the city skyline, the golden hues of sunset bathing the buildings. A journal lay open on the table beside him, its pages filled with goals, reflections, and sketches of dreams yet to be realized. Many of the items on his list had already been checked off. Learned to kayak done. He'd spent a weekend on the river with friends, laughing as he capsized more than once. Volunteer more, a work in progress, but the mentorship program with Maya had turned into one of the most rewarding experiences of his life. Travel to Iceland, booked for the following summer, an adventure he was genuinely excited for. Life wasn't perfect, but it felt fuller, more authentic. His days were filled with small joys, like cooking a recipe he'd finally mastered, sharing a laugh with a friend, or seeing Maya's face light up when she grasped a new legal concept. One evening, as Nick walked through a local art fair, he bumped into Elena from the cooking class. They hadn't seen each other in weeks, but the easy rapport between them was still there. They wandered the stalls together, talking about everything from work to travel dreams. When she mentioned her plans to visit Paris, Nick surprised himself by saying, "I've been thinking about going too. Maybe we could swap notes or itineraries." Her smile in response was warm, genuine. "Or just go together," she said lightly, and for the first time in a long while, Nick felt the spark of possibility. It wasn't about rushing into something new. He was no longer trying to fill a void or prove a point. This was different, grounded in mutual respect and shared curiosity. Whether it became something more didn't matter yet. For now, it was simply nice to feel connected. As the night deepened, Nick returned home and flipped through his journal. On a fresh page, he wrote, "Life doesn't always turn out the way you plan, but sometimes the unexpected paths are the ones worth taking. I'm not defined by what I lost, but by what I've gained and what I'll continue to build." Nick closed the journal, feeling a quiet sense of peace. His journey wasn't over, it never would be, but he was no longer weighed down by the past. He was free to move forward, to explore, to embrace the future on his own terms. And for the first time, he truly believed the best was yet to come.